Bonjour, our wonderful Cartesian spirits. You're maybe just getting into these sessions of spirit now. We're on number 34, but it's a lot to take in if you've never read Hegel before. And even if you have read Hegel, it's still a lot if you haven't put 3,000 hours in, just to cover the basics. But let us get some context around where we are. You're jumping into what's called the circle of reason that Hegel was talking about, a self-grounding circle. And Descartes is a critical piece in this on how to start philosophy. We're about to enter what Hegel calls the native soil of philosophy itself. And up until this point, we haven't been necessarily carrying with that. That's kind of why Descartes plays a central role in developing philosophy to Hegel. So I will give you a recap of the first 34 sessions, and I'll try and do it in 2 minutes, and I hope you enjoy. In the first session, we said Hegel was the greatest philosopher because he summed up 100 or so philosophers in one philosophical system. The second session is that nobody understood how he did this for 200 years. Third session is that we have our spirits emboldened and they become practically wise to change the world once we understand him. The fourth session is that we get past the stereotypes of Hegel as a fascist, totalitarian, sexist, and all this, because those are just the first negation. The fifth session is that once you grasp Hegel, you get into the circle of reason. The fifth session is that at the end of the circle of reason, it looks religious, but philosophy is the sublation of religion, not the abstract negation, because seven, there is this total logic that covers everything that we're going to put into analytic notation to win the Nobel Peace Prize. This is the universal logic that looks religious. The eighth session is that this kind of profound logic begins with polemics, but number 9 is that the truth of polemics is sublation. This is genuine refutation, the negation of that negation. The 10th session is a masterclass in this kind of blessed peacemaking called the science of logic. The 11th session is that this is literally the pure thought categories themselves being put into order and sublated as the ineffable speaking itself. The 12th session is that this is the purpose of life, to grasp this logic in a living way. To session 13, release the spirit in everybody. To 14, feel connected to God. To 15, which is an atheistic way of also saying connection to yourself, or you can say it atheistically, not just theistically. 16 is that gurus were just doing this for thousands of years as the science of logic implicit. 17 is that we have to sublate into the new mysticism from the old mysticism to grasp the power of now. 18 is that the limit of our philosophical reason is the limit of our games and flow and fun. 19 is that you can make philosophy fun again by laughter. Polemics are actually just laughter. The 20th session is that the ideal philosopher synchronizes all philosophies and sublates them. To 21, overcome evil, which is one-sidedness. To 22, use wisdom to guide our new technologies that are disruptive and lacking wisdom. 23 is that we have to develop this logic more concretely with the synchronicity doctrine of philosophies to really grasp the universality of it. 24 is that this new world spirit will emerge by supercharging interpersonal dynamics. 25th is that we're going to sublate particulars, not just say we can do it, but we showed it with all the major religions. 26 is that we also sublated the opposite, which is existentialism. 27 is that we sublated capitalism, socialism, communism as a community, economic, political regime, kind of creating this spiritual crisis. To 28, also sublate Buddhism as the atheistic religion. To 29, sublate absolute atheism itself with this total logic. To 30, grasp ourselves in this as the sublation of it all. Real, concrete God, apotheosis, theopoiosis. 31 is that language itself is objective in doing this speculative logic. 32 is that horror itself is just incompleteness, that you can sublate that too and overcome double binds. And 33 is that you can overcome double binds collectively as well, because that's all that history was with colonialism and trying to impose on each other in this trap of thinking, this tangle of thinking that wasn't genuinely philosophical yet. So that leads us to today. Number 34 is called Where Descartes Went Wrong with Cogito Ergo Sum. The SOS in the session stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls, because real philosophy is practical and not just theoretical. So the summary of today has to do with this picture. Of course, with Descartes, we break out of abstract or old ways of thinking. We break out of sort of religious consciousness, and we break out of the matrix into philosophy, actual philosophy now. So the paragraph goes like this. It is not enough to grasp the supersensuous nature of genuine philosophy. It is only the beginning of philosophy as philosophy. Even in the medium of pure thought in its supersensuous glory, philosophy must continue to develop. This is evidenced by Descartes. Hegel points out Descartes' limit by becoming more Descartean than Descartes. Descartes, I guess we could just say that he's more Cartesian than Descartes. And Descartes managed to perform the absolute negation and arrive at the first contact of supersensuous thought and the beginning of divine thought. However, he did not arrive at the true foundation and still contained an implicit bias in this cogito ergo sum. The pure I is not the true beginning or foundation of all. It is not the pure, explicit, pure divine thought of infinite science. Descartes was making an assumption in the world of pure thought, and he was not skeptical enough to catch it. But Hegel did and exposed it so as to not only sublate the religious mode of philosophy, but also these early abstract philosophies, which were finally in the purity of thought itself, i.e., the native soil of genuine philosophy. This is a tremendous advance that Hegel raised into a realm never before discovered and bolstered his ability to spread the ideas of genuine philosophy in an ideal way, which would begin to break free and not repeat the brutality and oppression of colonialism, but raise him as a leader of his age. Genuine philosophy had finally found its true root and explicitly manifested itself concretely for the first time in history. Abstract philosophy, in general, had at last been raised into a higher spirit. We're going to get into the notes now, which should be free. We're going to unpack that paragraph and its dialectical unfolding. So for anybody who's just joining in, these sessions are for everybody. I have quite a bit of university education, about 12 years in open studies and part-time, but I don't have an actual formal degree. I never applied for one. So I am only a high school diploma. So don't think that just because you're not credentialed or educated that you can't understand this, even though at this point it's starting to get quite complicated, because we're not saying incredibly complicated things necessarily. We're just using a new order of logic that the ordinary consciousness has a hard time grasping. So because the words are being used in an unfamiliar way to you, because most of us have absorbed a sort of tangled mess from society, and when we absorb that, it makes our thinking a mess, or at least a little bit less clear than what we would normally consider, philosophy or philosophical wisdom that we're striving for as a society all the time, and as individuals, constantly trying to improve. But I have done my homework. I've read Hegel for about 3,000 hours to kind of get us all going and say this is the real way we're supposed to read this tremendous wisdom, because it can help us change the world. So don't feel dismayed if some of this looks unfamiliar. When you look back, it should start becoming more clear. And I'll do my best in this session now with Descartes, a relatively well-known philosopher who says kind of more ordinary things, but still made a genuine contribution to philosophy. So let's pick up where we left off last time. In the last session, we were talking about colonialism and reason, how this was kind of reason coming into the world, but it was very brutal and oppressive at first because we were stuck on our sensuous symbols and not grasping the supersensuous logic, the logic that's underneath and moving everything that you can't feel, taste, touch, smell. You can't sensuously perceive it. It's only in pure thought. That's why your mind grasps it. So we want to move from sublating the double binds, those traps of thinking that happen to us when we get severely traumatized by these dialectics that are not sublated, or we're not allowed to be free on them. They trap us individually. So borderline personality disorder, all these types of cognitive dissonance in our mind is really just these opposite pairs that are in the wrong order, not in this plant kind of growing, living way, or we're not allowed to explore them fully because when we were younger, we were maybe traumatized into choosing one side was wrong, choosing the other side was wrong, choosing the middle ground was wrong. Even talking about the no-win that we're in is also wrong. When you're put into enough of these traps and you don't know the logic of how to get out, it can really cause paralysis in your own personality and in your own mind. In extreme situations, it causes the opposite of wisdom. It causes people to break down, develop disorders, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, maybe tons of identity problems too, because we're not allowed to think freely and flow with the world like we were meant to as children. So this happens in individuals, but it also happens in communities. And that's kind of what was happening in history. We are sublating that and making it more fluid. But now we have to make this logic hyper clear, extra clear, so that we can enter real philosophy and start using this logic in a pure way to accelerate these sublations, these transcendings of these oppositions that trap us, so that our relationships get better, so that we can live to a higher potential within ourselves, our communities get better, our schools, our policing, our governments, our state, and our spirituality, our spirit itself is created by this freedom. The point of it all is genuine freedom, as we covered in the previous sessions. So let us liberate ourselves further by gaining an even greater clarity on how to start flowing with the nature of reality itself, pure thought, and its dialectic, its speculative nature as being contradictory, but resolving that contradiction with the right ordering of things that Hegel gives us. So when we're entering philosophy now, we're going to repeat what we did before in religious consciousness. So in the previous sessions, we talked about canceling sin, canceling the original sin in the Christian religion, which is where Hegel said that's where religious consciousness reached its summit. Philosophy is going to do the same logic, except with more modern terms, with these more scientific philosophical terms that Descartes used. And we come out of this kind of scholastic period of about 1,000 years, and we kind of get this revival of the sciences, Bruno and all these other philosophers, theologians. But Descartes kind of comes in and says, we're creating a new beginning. And it's with this concept of what can we really know in epistemology? What can I really be certain of? If all my senses and everything is corruptible, I can be tricked. What can I really know? Well, let us repeat this movement of canceling sin with the way he wants to do it. So canceling sin is the same way of saying getting rid of knowledge that's finite or false, or leads us to bad decision making or things like that. Descartes is kind of saying the same thing in terms of just knowledge itself has an epistemological limit. And of course, Hegel solves this problem, but we want to sort of show where Descartes is in terms of the whole system of things. So we talked about the circle of reason before. Everything is on the circle of reason. So where do we begin philosophy on the circle of reason itself? We covered some other versions of this, but I give you the circle again. And if you're new to this, you're not going to recognize any of this making sense. What is the spirit? What is pure being? What is nature? These are big sections in Hegel's philosophy, and they sort of circle back around and connect to each other. It's a self-grounding system. By self-grounding, that means it has a start that becomes its end, and the end connects back to the beginning. It grounds it. It's like the solid thing that the beginning comes from. But how's that possible, right? How can the beginning be the result? The beginning has a result, that's its end, but its end is the beginning's beginning now. They switch places. But Descartes is somewhere on here. He made a real contribution, but it's not where he thinks it is. So where is Hegel in terms of pure knowing? What can we actually know in philosophy? Philosophy is about the search of wisdom and truth, right? Well, how can we know what is really true when we're sinful in religious consciousness, or with Descartes, we're ignorant? we can be tricked with our senses. A demon could come and trick us, and then make our knowledge not true. So where's Hegel and where's Descartes, and how do they differ and how are they the same? There's two ways of thinking. There's genuinely philosophical thinking, and then there's ordinary thinking. And Hegel's going to show us how to think, not just tell us how. He's going to actually start making us do that with his words, which is why he's so difficult to read, because he's writing in a speculative way where he won't let your mind read him in the ordinary way. You're going to want to take the words that you think you know and put it onto the sentences because the words look familiar. He's using ordinary words except for the word sublation. That's the one you will not have seen before. But if you look at the other sessions, it's just this movement of growing. So it's really easy for the ordinary consciousness to want to edify or like chop up and fragment this fluidity he's trying to show you between the words. They actually move with this supersensuous logic underneath. And it doesn't move in double binds. He's freeing himself. He's using these words in the full freedom that we're supposed to, but we're not used to that because we're restricted. We're like in a straitjacket of language. Whereas, children, we've been conditioned not to talk about certain things, or, there's dogma in the world that we're not allowed to know, or there's a beyond that we're never allowed to question because it's so far beyond us. But that's not what Hegel says. So when you try and fix his words, it's going to be painful at first, but you have to carry with it because he's trying to show us this life, this living way that is better than what we're doing now. And it's what Descartes was trying to do in a certain way, but he didn't do it all the way. So let's get into this freedom past double binds. We now, by this point, have the faith to want to carry with this dialectic, this type of difficult reasoning that leads to freedom. Number two is we have the freedom of philosophical openness to do it. So we want to do it. We have the faith that the world is rational. Number two is that we have the openness to try and do it. So we're talking about dialectics, opening them up, starting to sublate even religious consciousness, art, the state, the abstract state, or the irrational state. Number three is we also have the method to actually do it in ourselves. So that's what this session is. Now we actually have the space to do this. Philosophy is starting to open up. Now we can find out how to do it, starting with Descartes. So what we have to begin with is philosophy is the sublation of religion. That means that we're preserving something in religion, which is God, the concrete totality, the absolute, but we're canceling the sensuousness and entering the realm of pure thought for the first time. So pure thought has no sensuousness in it, can't taste it, touch it, smell it, anything like that. And he says Hegel says you have to begin sort of, if it's genuine science, you have to begin with a method that is no method. Because if the method is outside of the system, then it's unjustified, right? Where does the method come from? Who told you that the method was right? So if it's not in the system doesn't justify it in itself, then there's always something you're assuming which might not be true. So he says there's a paradox here where the method that creates the system has to itself be created by that system it created, That's what self-grounding is. It's got to be in a circle where the beginning is the end is the beginning. And I told a couple of versions of this already, where we had a negative beginning in session of spirit number 5, a positive beginning, and we had this canceling of sin, and we had this absolute atheism where the axioms have to ground themselves. All of this kind of stuff first came to me when I started to realize what Hegel was saying about Descartes, and that Descartes kind of had a method that was trying to be no method because he wasn't certain that the method could be true. So he had to question any kind of methodology. And so he started performing a nascent version of what Hegel did to start his entire philosophy, that circle at the top. So let's talk about what Descartes did to perform this beginning, what he thought was the beginning of true knowledge, the beginning of true philosophy, and then try and explain a few passages of how Hegel talks about him and what his limit was, what Descartes did wrong, or the limit that he couldn't surpass to get to the genuine philosophy that Hegel is showing us with this speculative free thinking. So if Descartes didn't reach genuine philosophy, what did he start with? He started with abstract philosophy. So it wasn't this concrete totality, it was kind of chopped up a little bit. But Descartes did try and do this absolute negation where he tried to cancel everything. Remember, negation is that first moment where we're trying to cancel or we're creating separation from something that is not us. Or you're just trying to say, okay, you're creating a separation. And he's saying, okay, well, Descartes tried to do this absolute negation. That part was right. But it was only an abstract absolute negation, if that makes any sense. He didn't have a concrete version of it that went all the way. Descartes only negated his knowledge, the senses, his finite self. He stayed in his finite self, and he didn't perform what we did all the way with canceling original sin. So in terms of religious language, we canceled everything we thought we knew as sinful knowledge, but we also canceled our sinful being itself. And we made it an ontological move. That's what Descartes did not do. Descartes canceled his knowledge in an epistemological kind of way, but he didn't cancel it in terms of his being. He stayed in his finite subjectivity. Kind of in a way, he stayed in his own sensuousness. But he said that the consciousness you arrive at when you negate everything you think you know is a universal kind of consciousness. We're all this kind of consciousness. And so he says, not just my particular, it kind of goes amongst everybody. So he's saying, I don't even know that I really exist. I just know that there's this thinking nature of me that is the I think, therefore I am. So he tried to falsify or tried to find the falsity in his thinking. But he ended up with a finite version of this where the thinking self was still preserved. So why does the self-consciousness, why does the I, the thinking I, have to be there to do the thinking? And this is a question that Descartes kind of skirted around, as we'll see. But Hegel says it's a fundamental assumption that he was supposed to cancel if he would have went all the way. But he didn't. The cogito ergo sum is the limit of the negation. It doesn't go farther back. And Hegel says there's a lot that kind of this pure I is built on that we have to be critical of, but Descartes wasn't. Why wasn't he? Because look at this first quote here. He just took it as self-evident. It just, well, I think, therefore I am. It's so fundamentally self-evident. It just immediately knows itself as thinking that you can't even question it. So from Hegel's lesser logic, if you look on the screen here, he says, and yet it was as self-evident or immediate truth that the cogito ergo sum of Descartes, the maxim on which may be said to hinge the whole interest of modern philosophy, was first stated by its author. So that's why we're starting with it, because it's supposed to be the beginning of philosophy. And Hegel says it does, but it's not the true beginning. The man who calls this a syllogism must know a little more about a syllogism than that the word ergo, therefore, occurs in it. Because in a syllogism, you have the major premise, the minor premise, and then the sort of therefore conclusion. So this, that, therefore this. So he's making a little bit of a pun in a way, or a parallel, that this thing that Descartes did was not a true syllogism. He didn't understand. It was a superficial way of understanding, is Hegel's point here. Where shall we look for the middle term? And a middle term is a much more essential point of a syllogism than the word ergo. If we try to justify the name by calling the combination of ideas in Descartes an immediate syllogism, this superfluous variety of syllogism is a mere name for an utterly unmediated synthesis of distinct terms of thought. That being so, the synthesis of being with our ideas, as stated in the maxim of immediate knowledge, has no more and no less claim to the title of syllogism than the axiom of Descartes has. From Hotho's dissertation on the Cartesian philosophy, published in 1826, I borrow the quotation in which Descartes himself distinctly declares that the maxim cogito ergo sum is no syllogism. The passages are, and it gives the titles here, says, from the first passage, I quote the words more immediately to the point. Descartes says, that we are thinking beings is prima quidem notio qua est nullo syllogismo concluditor, a certain primary notion which is deduced from no syllogism. And then he goes on in a bunch of Latin, which means, nor when one says, I think, therefore I am or exist, does he deduce existence from thought by means of a syllogism. Why is Hegel pointing this out? Because he says Descartes knew what it implied in a syllogism. And so he adds that in order to make the maxim admit of a deduction by syllogism, we should have to add the major premise. And the major premise would be everything which thinks is or exists. So Hegel is narrowing in on the assumption that Descartes does not want to acknowledge, but knows is kind of there. So he's saying this is the most fundamental thing. There's nothing that comes before it. Nothing mediates this cogito. But Hegel is saying, actually, the reason why Descartes is resisting the syllogism is because the syllogism means mediation, because you have multiple terms being connected, right? So it's not just one thing immediately there. So if he admits it's a syllogism, which is the universal form of reason to Hegel, everything rational is a syllogism, including this. But Descartes knew that his claim that we could just take it as self-evident that the thinking self exists, that doesn't need to be proven with a syllogism. It just is as it is. Take it as it is. It's basically what we covered in abstract or in absolute atheism in Sessions of Spirit number 29, I believe, where the axioms we make are taken as self-evident, but they're revelation. They're not justified or proven. They just look so simple and fundamental that we don't have to prove them. They prove themselves. But Hegel says this is a mistake. Everything has to be proven. Even pure being, which Hegel begins with, is a presupposition. It's a no presupposition. So that's how he gets away with a presupposition that he doesn't have to assume, because all he's assuming that he's canceling all presupposition. But the premise, if Descartes was to include it here, that would make sense of this, that would connect being and thinking, existence and thinking, would be everything which thinks is or exists. So those are the two terms that are connecting together what should be the first premise, because we're saying that you can't have one without the other. But Descartes is resisting this, and people, when they read the lesser logic of Hegel, this isn't the intro part of it. They read this and it doesn't seem to make any sense. Like, what's Hegel really saying here? Why is he critiquing Descartes here? Descartes had a pretty fundamental beginning. But Hegel's pointing out that all this weird stuff that Descartes was doing, he was doing because he was avoiding an assumption he was making, that Descartes, the Cogito Ergo Sum is not the true beginning. And Descartes knew that. But Hegel makes a little bit of fun of him here in a second, because he really resists this, because as soon as you say it's a syllogism and it's mediated, you have to tell what the terms are. But Descartes wasn't clear enough to separate what the terms were or how they would give rise to themselves. So Hegel's next quote goes like this. He says, the language of Descartes on the maxim that the I which thinks must also at the same time be, is saying that this connection is given and implied in the simple perception of consciousness, that this connection is the absolute first, the principle, the most certain and evident of all things, so that no skepticism can be conceived so monstrous as not to admit it. And so here I highlighted a little bit that really Hegel's hyperbolizing. He's making fun of Descartes a little bit, because true philosophy allows you to question things and get to the dogma and see if it's really true, and you can think it for yourself. Remember this, one of the central principles of Hegel is that Übermensch principle. You're supposed to grasp the thoughts determinately for yourself. And here Descartes wants to stop you from questioning. So anybody who even tries to question, he's, I can't believe, he makes you look like a fool. Is that how monstrous of you to question something so simple, you know? It's like 1 + 1 = 2. You're like, you're not even smart enough to grasp that. And of course, this is all just rhetoric to undermine your intuition as a reasonable being that something's not quite right here if you're catching on to this. And Hegel, of course, sees it right away because Hegel sees the categories very clearly. So he's making fun of Descartes a little bit for this reason. And he kind of goes on to say, continuing in this lesser logic, this is where Hegel does this big explanation of Descartes. And why is he covering Descartes in the beginning before he even starts his logic in the encyclopedia? It's because he's trying to justify how to start the beginning of true philosophy. And he's saying the science of logic is the true beginning of philosophy. Other people say, you'll hear this if you go read Hegel, start with the phenomenology of spirit. Why? Because that was Hegel's first masterwork. And he said it was the beginning, the introduction into a system. But it's an introduction. It's not necessarily the logical beginning. He's trying to track down now what is the logical beginning. And he's saying it's not Descartes, but Descartes was on the right path. He just wasn't Descartes enough. He didn't carry his own movement to its own contradiction. So we're sitting here about to reveal a superficial kind of contradiction that Descartes was trying to ignore in three principles that not only him, but Jacobi was also making with this immediacy. Remember, immediacy is what axioms want to start with because you don't have to prove an immediacy. It's just self-evident. The first principle that you have to assume is the simple inseparability of the thought and being of the thinker. He says, Cogito Ergo Sum is the same doctrine as that the being, reality, and existence of the ego is immediately revealed to me in consciousness. So revelation means that it doesn't have to be really justified. It can come from a God. It just happens immediately. And we have that experience. We don't think about thinking about ourselves. It just happens. We just know ourselves to be thinking immediately. And this is the kind of thing that leads us to think Descartes was right because it seems to line up with our experience. But there's something else happening here which looks like that's happening, but it's actually not the full truth. This is supposed to be the absolute first, not mediated or demonstrated or anything, but the second principle has to do with this inseparability of existence from the conception of God. The former is necessarily implied in the latter, or the conception never can be without the attribute of existence, which is thus necessary and eternal. Descartes says in his book, the reader will be more disposed to believe that there exists a being supremely perfect if he notes that in the case of nothing else is there found in him an idea in which he notices necessary existence to be contained in the same way. So he wants to make this example that I think, therefore I am. Existence is a part of it. I am means existence. So as you're thinking, you don't want to separate from existence because then you could be like a theoretical thinking that maybe you don't really exist. But he's trying to say, no, this is kind of what I guess maybe God does, and you're in the image of this. And he wants to say that you have to think this way. It kind of is evident, it's obvious that this has to be true. So you can read the rest of the paragraph here, but the whole point of these principles is that they're all assumed, and the proof actually isn't all that good. Hegel says that they're just trying to approximate other categories in the science of logic, but they're doing it kind of in sensuous form. And he gives you a little hint here of what categories they're actually hinging upon, but they're not thinking them concretely. He said, God is that of which the notion and the being are inseparable. And the notion is supposed to be kind of like our imaginary world, and being is supposed to be what exists in like the real world, the world that resists you and isn't just in your head, right? So he's saying that this kind of thinking that we're doing is in our heads, yes, but it's not like a imaginary kind of thinking. It's like the kind of thinking you do, which actually is your being. It says you are real when you do this. And the last one that he assumes is the immediate consciousness of the existence of external things. By this, nothing more is meant than sense consciousness. To have such a thing in the slightest of all cognitions. Oh, to have such a thing is the slightest of all cognitions. So I highlighted here that by sense consciousness, he means in the phenomenology of spirit. The very first chapter is about sense certainty, where it just sense data comes into you, into your nascent mind. It doesn't have all these crazy categories. It's just trying to think of space and time, very basic sensuous categories. And he's saying this is an immediate thing. You're not having to think this. This is just like immediately happening. And it's something that you can be certain of. This goes along with I think. Your thinking does this automatically. So it doesn't have to be justified or proven that it happens because we just know it to happen. So this all sounds very convincing that cogito ergo sum, based on these principles, is just immediate. And it doesn't have to be proven any further. That's why we could start on it. If a demon tries to come and trick you about this immediacy, that you're not immediately knowing that you're thinking, then you have to be thinking to realize that you're not thinking. If a demon comes and tries to trick you, that you're not immediately thinking and existing as thinking, then you have to be, the moment you had that realization that you weren't thinking, you have to be thinking to have that realization. So you can't be tricked that you're not thinking because it contradicts itself, where it proves that you're thinking if somebody's trying to show you you're not thinking. Sounds pretty airtight, right? How does Hegel start more fundamental than this? How do you base pure knowing on something that's more skeptical than that? There's literally nothing, we're not taking anything for granted, right? This actually explains our experience and our phenomenology pretty well. But Hegel goes on, and I'm going to quote some paragraphs on what skepticism really is supposed to mean. And so he says, skepticism, which is what Descartes is trying to do, he's trying to falsify everything he possibly can to get to something true. This ultimate skepticism, this absolute negation. He says, skepticism made a negative science and systematically applied to all forms of knowledge. Skepticism made a negative science and systematically applied to all forms of knowledge might seem a suitable introduction as pointing out the nullity of such assumptions. But a skeptical introduction would be not only an ungrateful, but also a useless course, and that because dialectic, as we shall soon make appear, is itself an essential element of affirmative science. So we're going to go and question all these principles that Descartes said makes his beginning the true beginning. And we're going to say, we're going to do this absolute skepticism, do this absolute negation to a much greater degree than Descartes did. But in the end of this, there is actually not just pure nothingness, it results in something affirmative. Dialectic is just the negative moment of reason that we know sublates into a positive moment because it's the negation of negation. When you take it and apply it to itself, you end up in this kind of contradiction where it turns into its opposite. So he says, when we try and do what Descartes did here in the proper way, it's going to flip us from this absolute negation to something positive like Descartes, some kind of immediacy, but it's got to be a deeper kind of immediacy than these principles, which Descartes is avoiding anybody questioning, because if you question it, it'll come out that there's a syllogism there or there's some kind of mediation of terms. There's different things being combined. There's more than just one thing there. So he says further about skepticism, you have to begin the beginning skeptically. He says skepticism, besides, could only get a hold of the finite forms as they were suggested by experience, taking them as given instead of deducing them scientifically. To require such a skepticism accomplished is the same as to insist on science being preceded by universal doubt or a total absence of presupposition. Strictly speaking, in the resolve that wills pure thought, this requirement is accomplished by freedom, which, abstracting from everything, grasps its pure abstraction, the simplicity of thought. So if we don't begin with the cogito ergo sum, Hegel says you have to begin with this. But if you read it, it's really unfamiliar, and most people don't know how to interpret this. This is a famous passage, or one of the famous passages that's really cryptic, and you don't know where in the heck Hegel is, really. If this is not the cogito ergo sum, then what is he trying to start with here when he's trying to repeat the skepticism that Descartes did by negating all of his senses to get at it just himself as pure thought? Now, the reason why Hegel still considers Descartes the beginning of philosophy is because once you negate all sensuousness, your mind actually is a universal for a universal. It is pure thought for itself as pure thought. In your internal world, your thinking isn't happening in sensuous reality. It's in your body, you could say, but your inner world it's like it's pure thought. Your thoughts are moving in pure thought, your imagination, stuff like that. So when he negated all his senses, he did arrive there. He did arrive at this pure thought world that's in the sensuous world, but it's not by itself yet. It's still in the finite kind of version, and it contains this self in it. It's not just pure thought. There's a self thinking that pure thought, and we're now narrowing in that the kind of skepticism Hegel's going to be performing is going to get further into that pure thought world. And he's saying that when you do this skepticism properly, you are incredibly resolved to do it the right way. You are like hardcore committed to not leaving anything negated or unnegated. You want to negate everything you think you know. And in the sentence, resolve, so he says, resolve that wills pure thought. What does he mean by resolve that wills pure thought? He's just saying that your pure self, who you think you are, is pure thought, resolving in that pure thought to do this negation of everything. He's saying this is a requirement to accomplish this kind of freedom from everything you think you know that's finite and perhaps, devious or not true knowledge. So when you do this to everything, you're abstracting from everything, separating yourself from it, leaving it, canceling it. But what happens is that abstraction leads you to this simplicity of thought, this true immediacy, which is what these principles of Descartes are trying to approximate. You do get to another immediacy, but it's not the self-thinking thought. It's not, I think, therefore I am. He's saying when you get to this really, really fundamental, when you really do abstract from literally everything, that includes the thinking self that Descartes is assuming is linked with existence, is linked with God, is linked with immediacy. He's saying it's not. When you're thinking, there's more than one thing happening here, because there's you and then there's the thought you're thinking. So there's automatically like two things, at least two things. Where we're going to end up here with this absolute, true, absolute negation, the Descartes that is more Descartes than Descartes, is that we're going to negate even that self. We're going to negate that implicit mediation and say we don't need a self to think thought. We're canceling it all. We're canceling all the thought that we think we know sensuously. We're canceling the self. We're canceling the body. We're canceling nature. We're canceling literally everything until we have just the pure thought realm, because we got rid of nature, right? We have just the pure thought realm. And we're going to negate everything in the imagination, everything that we think is in this pure supersensuous realm where the science of logic is happening, where our thoughts or categories are by themselves without us even there. Hegel says that's objective, right? He says you can't even assume that. Now we're literally getting down to something so simple that it is so abstract that it is literally just pure thought that has no self in it. It is thinking, therefore is. So not I think, therefore I am. The I is the assumed thing there. It's just, there is no I. There is just thinking, therefore is. And that's where we're supposed to end up. There is an affirmative here. After all of our negations, we negate that negation and we end up in this sort of thinking, therefore is, which is another fancy way of saying pure being. So for people that might have read Hegel before, this might not make any sense. But this last little bit, when pure thought, you as the thinker, sort of grasp for the first time the true beginning, you're looking at pure thought, the beginning of pure thought from your consciousness as pure thought. This beginning is the beginning of you. It develops itself, and then you are the I that is more concrete, that pure beginning, pure being turned into. So this simplicity of thought is really pure being. Now you have an end to where Hegel now is. He's starting now for the first time. After negating everything, he's starting at the beginning, the negative beginning of his system. And the very first thought that we have is this pure abstraction that's not a I think, therefore I am. It's just literally thinking, therefore is, what he calls pure being, which is a sheer immediate indeterminacy. It's not immediate of something. It is just sheer immediacy, right? With Descartes, we have the I is immediately thinking. It has immediate sense data. Well, there is no sense data. There's no even distinction between sense data and the thinking eye. It's just immediacy by itself. That's kind of amazing. This is before nature, before anything else. This is what Descartes would have done if he would have carried his absolute negation all the way to the beginning. That's the hard thing that we can't grasp unless we get out of our sensuous minds completely. But we're not good at that, which is why Descartes couldn't do it. He couldn't get out of that assumption. But Hegel did. So here's another quote. We're gonna start the actual science of Hegel now. So we've transcended Descartes. And a lot of people say, well, Mark, you created this interpretation, this negation and absolute negation, all this kind of stuff, and thoughts are just thinking themselves. That's all a bunch of hooey. That's a bunch of metaphysical stuff that Hegel doesn't really do. But here's the quotes where I got it from. And if you're a scholar, I hope you find these really illuminating. And I think my interpretation at least is in the right direction compared to the last 200 years, and how most people would read this one silently. So let's start the science of logic in this true beginning, this true immediacy. He says, the distinction between being and not is, in the first place, only implicit and not yet actually made. They only ought to be distinguished. A distinction, of course, implies two things. They only ought to be distinguished. A distinction, of course, implies two things, right? And that one of them possesses an attribute which is not found in the other. Now, I highlighted this part. Being, however, is an absolute absence of attributes, and so is not. Hence, the distinction between the two is only meant to be. So what he's saying is, this simplicity of thought that we've arrived at after we've abstracted from everything is being, but it turns itself into its opposite, which is pure nothing. And we like to think, well, there's two things here, but actually there is and there isn't. We're getting this kind of speculative movement that there's supposed to be an attribute which one has that the other doesn't have, but we're so close to absolute nothingness that they don't have an attribute that's not common to them. They're both absolutely nothing. Sheer immediate indeterminacy for pure being, that then when it tries to know itself turns into pure nothing because there's nothing in it that it can know. But as soon as it tries to know what that is, what's the predicate of that, it turns back into its being, and they go back and forth. So they have the exact same attributes. The attributes are only something that is kind of meant. And you kind of get this determinacy based off of indeterminacy, where they're both indeterminate. It's like a shared indeterminacy, which is kind of a paradox, right? That's why he says it's a distinction that's no distinction. So this is kind of, once you're done this absolute negation, you get into this kind of nature of what pure being is. It's no, I think, therefore I am. This is actually how the pure beginning starts. Way less than a thinking self. So then he kind of goes on to say, suppose we think of two species. The genus forms a common ground between both. But in the case of mere being and nothing, a distinction is without a bottom to stand upon, because all that's sitting there is just the cancellation of presupposition. It's that absolute negation that negates itself, and then it results into an affirmative. There's nothing else down there. So there's nothing to really distinguish them. They're both sitting on top of that at the same time. If it be replied that being and nothing are both of them thoughts, so that thought may be reckoned common ground, the objector forgets that being is not a particular or definite thought, and hence, being quite indeterminate is a thought not to be distinguished from nothing. So he's saying that they're not two particular thoughts that are solid in themselves. They're both thought because we're in the pure world of thought. Everything is thought in this world. Nature hasn't been developed yet. This is still so primordial that we're just in the supersensuous realm. No sensuous yet. No color, no taste, none of that stuff. So these aren't particular thoughts that are interchanging. They're actually the same thought turning into its opposite as still itself. So that's kind of this really hard to grasp beginning because we're not used to thinking this way. It's so indeterminate. So he goes on to say, but if when we view the whole world, we can only say that everything is and nothing more, we are neglecting all speciality, and instead of absolute plenitude, we have absolute emptiness. The same stricture is applicable to those who define God to be mere being, a definition not a whit better than that of the Buddhists who make God to be not, and who, from that principle, draw the further conclusion that self-annihilation is the means by which man becomes God. So remember, all the previous sessions that we talked about was about how religious consciousness's biggest mistake was that they made God a beyond. You couldn't determine it, you couldn't know anything in it. So that's what he's saying here. When you define God to be mere being, you're not saying anything, you're just saying it has a being. But you're not saying, well, what kind of being is it? Right? You can say, well, it's an all-knowing being, it's an omnipotent being. Yeah, these are all universal categories, but like, how does it actually work? Like, what's inside of it? It's just this big blob of being that's indeterminate that you'll never know. The thing in itself, it's a beyond. So that kind of being is where we sort of end up with in the beginning. And then the other side of it, the opposite that it turns into, is this pure not, this pure nothing, which is what the Buddhists were saying is the truth. But they can't say anything about that either. Nagarjuna kind of says that the emptiness is full, and that's the greater truth. But most people take it as another version of God that you can't say anything about. You just have to meditate and, just sit there and feel it and get out of your mind. So in a way, they're both indeterminate from different sides. One is like all emptiness. One is a sort of fullness that isn't defined. It's so full you can never know it. It's so perfect you can never know it. So it's the same indeterminacy. You're making them both unknowable gods. And he's saying this isn't the truth of, that's not where you're supposed to end. You're supposed to actually develop that. And it turns into all the determinations, that is the real God, the real science of logic that circles back on itself. That's how the beginning starts. And it's kind of a beautiful mix between how we sublated Buddhism and all the other forms of God, the Christian God, the scholastic God that was beyond. They're actually alternating in different combinations to develop all the dialectical stages of, pure becoming, determinate being, quality, something, other, determination, constitution. All of these are categories in our minds that we take for granted every day, but Hegel's putting them in this absolute order. And he's saying this is the proper way to think of these two indeterminacies that become slowly more and more determinate. So now we're talking about this canceling of sin from the philosophical pure thought version. We're saying the universal absolute negation is the only way into this circle, this eternal circle of logic. How do you begin eternity? Like we talked about in session number 5. Well, you begin it with this absolute negation that gets beyond cogito ergo sum. You get rid of all assumptions entirely. And I'm getting it from these kinds of passages where Hegel's just trying to explain how he begins his logic. That's why he talks about Descartes in the beginning. But no, nobody really ever talks about this because nobody could understand Hegel deeply enough to grasp what his critique is of Descartes. Because you have to understand the words, the dialectic of the words he's using, and the clarity that he's using them. So I tried to make it more simple of how you get from a sensuous creature down to this true beginning by going beyond Descartes. And it might sound complicated to you, but especially when we're using language like it's the presupposition, it's no presupposition, that's a contradiction. We're starting to talk in contradictions, which is kind of a sign of sophism if you're doing it in terms of double binds, but it's also the true nature of thought. It's like Russell's paradox is to set within sets. It's constant judging of the eye has to be there for it to judge itself. It's already in itself to judge. All these self-reflexive circles is actually how speculative thought really is. The universe really is this way. So to help you get into it a little bit more linearly, what you do to start true philosophy is step 1, you begin with human finite knowledge that you think you know, right? You're a creature here, you have a name, you're a human being. Okay, so step number 2 is now negate all that knowledge that you think you have in your head, just like Descartes did. Then step number 3 is now go further and continue the negation through your thinking self until there is absolutely nothing but this negating process left. So that's where you do the thing Descartes couldn't do. Step number 3 was the hard thing that Hegel could do. He's showing us that goes beyond Descartes' limit, and you cancel the self. So now step number 4 is this negation even negates its own self later. You might, I didn't really negate myself if I'm there watching it. Well, technically, if you really did this for real, you probably like leave this world, right? You cancel your sensuousness. Buddhists can control their heart and control a whole bunch of things from pure meditation in the place of pure thought. Maybe there is somebody who could do this in such an incredible way that they could just leave, they could just shut their consciousness off and actually cancel themselves. And this resolve might continue, just this pure negation will continue on its own to cancel everything. It leaves sensuousness behind, and it doesn't have a personality and all this kind of stuff. It's just this kind of like canceling of canceling. But you're there implicitly. That's the thing. You're not going to do this canceling. Hegel's just saying you're making yourself implicit by holding back all of your stuff, all your projections, all your delusions, all your whatever, right? Life experience. And you're just trying to observe the eternal process going on in its perfection as perfectly as you can possibly let it do its own thing. So you're just trying to get there. And once that negation negates itself, it turns into the opposite of that nothingness. It can't, once you've canceled everything, now you're going to cancel that canceling. Well, it can't go into the canceling because then it'll be itself again, right? So it's got to turn into something that it's not, which is affirmative, right? So the other stuff is negative, it's canceling everything. So the opposite of that is an affirmative. So it drives itself into an affirmative, but it can't have any content in it because we've canceled everything. So it's like a driving into an affirmative, an actual being that is really there, but you can't know anything in it. It's not, you've canceled everything, so there's nothing to compare it to, right? So it's just sitting there by itself, pure abstraction. There's no other beings around. You canceled all the other beings in step 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? So it leads you to step number 5, which is this sheer immediate indeterminacy. It's the noun form of abstraction. So we did all this verb stuff, or moving, canceling. But now that this is purely by itself, there's nothing around. There's no God, there's no nothing. It's just literally this affirmative that's not this canceling, that's all. And what it is, you can't really say. It's got nothing to compare to make a determination. You have to have two things to have a determination, like Hegel said earlier. So you're stuck with pure abstraction. It's the pure universal abstraction that is sheer immediate indeterminacy. It's there, or not you, well, you're watching it, but it itself is now there. It's an actual being that is there. It's an ontological movement. This isn't just happening in your head. You're watching something that it actually happened in an objective world, like we talked about with the Wittgenstein session of spirit that happened earlier. And this sounds absolutely incredible. It's like, no way, this is too fanatical. Like, this is imaginary stuff. But if you think about it logically, there's no other way to kind of begin with a less assumptions, with less positivity. Like, we're doing what Descartes did to everything. And Hegel says, if you try and start more with something different, you're going to be making an assumption that's greater than this one. So it says, is this not a logical derivation of how to go from normal human mind to pure being? Those are the kind of 5 steps. And we get it from this continuing of what Descartes tried to do with the Cogito Ergo Sum. I hope that makes the connection more clear. In the comments, I try and leave some notes explaining this more. But this concept of falsifiability, so Hegel made pure knowing and the science of logic falsifiable, like Karl Popper wanted, who was a big critic of continental philosophy, and especially Hegel. And Karl Popper, as this logical positivist, wanted in his philosophy of science this kind of falsifiability, where you can get beyond imagination and actually, prove things, not just have them as, these kind of fairies in the sky where you can say whatever you want and there's no way to prove it. He thought maybe this way Hegel's thinking was like that. But Popper was also not able to take the skepticism that he had, this kind of falsifiability, and apply it to the thought categories themselves. He didn't know that there was a logical order to the categories of the mind itself, not to an object that we apply categories to. We're not talking about a dog that has existence and being and appearance and it's a something, that's applying our thought categories to a dog. We're not falsifying that. we're falsifying the categories. No more dog. Just those categories I used to describe the dog. There's no dog we're describing. It's just the categories I just used, which was, something, being, existence. Those are the universals. Those themselves are growing into each other. And Karl Popper couldn't apply his skepticism fundamentally enough to perform that incredibly intense move. But because Hegel gives a logical order by the same method, which is no method, just negation turning itself into all the categories, which, as we know later on, it developed itself into the syllogism. And the syllogism is the universal form of reason that these movements are doing right from the beginning. It's just that the syllogism is implicit. So you can say, well, that's what Descartes was avoiding, was the syllogism that was meeting everything. And well, here Hegel's using a syllogism, so that means the beginning is mediated. Yes, it is. But the trick, remember, is that the terms are a presupposition that is no presupposition. It's a canceling of canceling that results in the affirmative. So yeah, it's a syllogism of pure canceling. So Hegel's getting his cake and eating it too. It's a mediation that in its mediating cancels itself into immediacy. That's the syllogism of the beginning. And it's pretty genius, because that's how he doesn't make the mistake of Descartes and says, you can't question my beginning, you can't apply a syllogism to it. But remember, everything that is actual is rational to Hegel. So that means even this very beginning move has to in some way, if it's rational and a part of the system, has to be a syllogism. And this is how he's doing it. So you can falsify the categories of your own thinking, though, by checking the coherence of them. How the principle of coherence that Wittgenstein was talking about with his language games, Hegel's kind of doing that with pure thought itself. Now we're just doing it as an extension of Descartes. They were all doing the same thing. They're all catching on to the universal logic from different perspectives. So by this point in the Sessions of Spirit, you just start feeling the universality that this is all these philosophers really just trying to do the same thing. But Hegel's the one that clarified it and showed all the assumptions, all the axioms that were unjustified, and started with the most fundamental one that he then builds the rest upon. And you can test those categories to see if they're coherent, if they really do follow the dialectical movement, the syllogistic form, and if they also correspond to reality in the correspondence model of truth. So this is how, in the second quote, this is how we falsify the metaphysical, sensuous, imaginary world that Popper and logical positivists never thought existed. But they're just assuming that their thoughts are given. So they are the ones in the end being a little bit hypocritical in that what they take to be subjective thoughts only might actually be coming from somewhere, and you have to justify where they're coming from. Why are there universals mixed up with the immediacy of nature? Why is there reason and chaos? Like, why isn't it all just randomness? How you describe that is like, well, it just is. It just reveals itself that way through nature, the laws of the universe. But Hegel's starting to give us a more satisfactory answer of not only where nature comes from after the development of the science of logic, he gives us the answer of where that reason comes from at all and why we can understand it. Because we are just in the image of it, we are just a repeating of that logic. And that's what religion was right about. They were catching on to this fractal nature, this fractal kind of repeating taking place between both worlds, the supersensuous world and between the world of nature. And then we are the mixing of the two, right? That's why we get mixed up. So it's a brilliant way to say, yeah, we are still doing real science with this imaginary supersensuous world. You can still check for coherence. And that's why Hegel says real philosophy is always kind of concrete. It always has multiple objects that are belonging to each other in a system. And a system is like applying the same rule, applying the same structure all the way through. And if there's a deviation, there has to be a good reason for that deviation. And if there isn't, then you're doing something wrong, you're making an opinion, or something is not fitting that you have to question. So of course I talk about this with the axioms. You have to apply them to your thoughts. We did that. We did a version of this with canceling sin, right? Session 6, 7, 25. And luckily, Hegel didn't make the mistake of Descartes or Karl Popper or anybody else who was trapped in sensuousness. He actually got to break out. He broke out of the matrix. And he got to see the true nature of thought and was able to withhold all of his cognitive biases enough to recognize it in the world and then check the coherence in a systematic way that justifies itself at every point, including its own beginning, the true beginning, which doesn't even assume that he's even there. And so this sounds pretty intense. Can we give an example of how you can falsify this? And Hegel luckily gives us an example of that. He says, some people think that we don't have to start with being, we should start with its opposite, pure nothing. So he's saying, here's what somebody will do in paragraph 164 of the Lesser Logic. When they try and do this absolute negation, he says, in the light of such recollection, the transition from being into nothing can be represented, or as it is said, explained and made intelligible as something even easy and trivial. Of course, the being which is made the beginning of the science is nothing. For abstraction can be made from everything, and if abstraction is made from everything, then nothing is left over. But it may be continued, the beginning is thus not an affirmative, not being, but just nothing. So here's somebody coming against Hegel, or he's saying this is what somebody does to him, and they're saying, no, this whole negation and abstract negation stuff, this is not how it really goes, Hegel. And even people like scholars are looking at me, high school guy, oh, you're not published. They're looking at me like, this stuff is all made up in your head, man. You didn't read Hegel for 3,000 hours. And if you did, this is your mystical interpretation. Hegel's far greater than your delusions. But that's why I'm giving you these paragraphs, because if you recognize the same thing, this is Hegel and an interpretation of Hegel that I think is hitting a lot, crossing a lot more T's and dotting a lot more I's than people want to maybe think about. Because we've interpreted Hegel in a one-sided way over the last 200 years. But he's doing it all. And so somebody's coming in to falsify the beginning and saying, no, logically, yeah, all we have is logic in the supersensuous world of pure thought where this beginning is taking place. But even using your own criterion of coherence here, Hegel, the systematic coherence, you're still starting with the wrong thing. You're not even following your own rule. Look, if you abstract from everything, you're just left with nothingness. All the being in the world is canceled, including your own self. Fine, you're canceling your own being too. Okay. And they're saying, okay, well, this is not an affirmative. You really have to begin with nothing. The Buddhists were right. Saying this pure nothing is even more immediate than this affirmative immediacy of pure being. The shortest way, he says, is to let such reasoning take its course and then wait and see what is the nature of its boasted results. That nothing would be the result of such reasoning, not abstracting, right? And that now the beginning should be made with nothing, as in the Chinese philosophy, need not cause us to lift a finger. A little audacious. He says, for before we could do so, this nothing would no less have converted itself into being. So he's going to approach this in two ways. And these paragraphs are really difficult to understand, but I think this breaks it down into something understandable. And if you look in the comments, I give you even more to think through this with. I'm just kind of going through the main quotes, but he's saying that based on the first refutation of this, if you just try and do this in your head, by the nature of dialectic itself, it turns into that nothing turns into pure being, just by itself, just by you thinking or trying to watch it, because you're just an observer. You're not actually doing this. The thoughts are doing this themselves. It'll turn itself into affirmative. So if you sit there and just let it do its own thing, that pure, you get rid of everything and it comes down to this nothing, try and hold that there. It turns itself into a positive without you lifting a finger, without you adding anything to it, because it's pure thought working on its own contradiction. That's what he's saying there. But he's saying there's a second thing we have to do to address this. And he's saying, but further, this abstraction from everything, which everything nevertheless is an affirmative being, so we're canceling all affirmative being like Descartes, having been presupposed, then it must be understood more exactly. The result of making abstraction from all that is first of all, abstract being. Being as such, just as in the cosmological proof of the existence of God and the contingent being of the world, in which proof we rise above such contingent being is still taken up with us in our ascent and is determined as infinite being. So in this cosmological proof, it's just saying that everything in the sensuous world is kind of connected and it's contingent ordering, and the thing that causes all those causes has to be behind the world or somewhere other than the world, like pure thought, and that it's supposed to be this uncaused cause kind of thing. He's saying that abstraction from all these contingent, like the nature, you're abstracting from that whole world, and you're getting at this different kind of being, which we now know is this supersensuous realm of pure thought, where the science of logic is thinking itself. So he's saying that's kind of what you're doing, is you can abstract and say, okay, there's still a being in this world, right? And this is what most people do with cosmological proof, is they don't question that being. But this person who's coming in to challenge Hegel, that even in this supersensuous realm, that being also has a problem that results in pure nothing. You should still, even with this cosmological proof God being thing that's not in the world, in its own world, this can still be reduced down to nothing. And here's how. Hegel says, the skeptic says, he's saying this existence of God from the continued being of the world, in which proof we rise above such continued being is still taken up with us in our ascent and is determined as infinite being, as the being behind the world. Of course, one can also abstract from this pure being. Being can be thrown in with the all from which abstraction has already been made. Then nothing remains. So let's say you abstract from the whole world, like the cosmological proof. Okay, get rid of all that affirmative being, like Descartes did. And then you even get rid of your thinking self, let's say. And there's this other thing that's greater than your thinking self that's still there, the being, the God being, basically. Well, after you abstract all this and you know about this being, then okay, cancel that too as part of the rest. Don't stop there. Negate that too. And it ends up at a true absolute abstract negation, which is back at nothing. So you have to start the system, Hegel, not with pure being, this affirmative. You have to start it with pure nothing. And so the skeptic is checking the coherence of Hegel's logic. He's saying, do we really have to use this logic to start with pure being? And the answer Hegel gives here is, well, yeah, you can do that. That's logical. He says, now, if we want to forget the thinking of nothing, that is, its conversion into being, or are ignorant of it, we can proceed in the style of one can, start with nothing. We can, for example, also abstract from nothing. For the creation of the world too is an abstraction from nothing. And then what remains is not nothing. For it is just from this that we have made abstraction. We have in fact arrived at being again. So now he was refuting this person. He's saying, yes, if you start with, you abstract even the God being, you abstract the world, you start with pure nothing. Well, thinking itself here, he's saying, forget the thinking of nothing. Thinking of nothing is the dialectic coming through it. And it is this thinking, which is abstract negation, applied to that first cancel, the absolute negation, right? So you negate from everything, including that God being, the cosmological God being, and you're left with a complete cancellation. Now, if you try and think that, your thinking, well, not even your thinking, the thinking of its own self is a negation in that negation. So it's a contradiction. The thinking, I guess the movement of it, I guess you could say, is that canceling of canceling by just thinking itself. So that thinking is the abstract negation on that nothing. So it's like a negation of negation, which leads to the sublation. That's why Hegel says, even if you try and do that, just by trying to let it finish, it turns into the pure being that Hegel says we should start with. And that's the first affirmative. It's the first real thing that has no presuppositions before it. And you could say, yeah, but this nothing and this thinking of nothing, even if it's only thinking itself, is it's happening. There's something. It's not like it's nothing there. It's like, yeah, it is nothing there, but it's nothing that is doing something. So that's a presupposition. But Hegel's point is, yeah, but it's the only presupposition that doesn't have anything in it, affirmative, because it's all just pure nothing and pure canceling. So he says, if you have anything more than that, he says you are starting with something of more affirmative than pure being. And so he's addressing this critic, saying it's still coherent that you can end up with this nothing, and it negates itself just by its own internal application to its own self, to try and cancel itself, to think its own canceling, turns it into an affirmative. But it's an affirmative not of anything, not of a dog or a space and time or anything. This isn't this timeless, spaceless world of just pure thought in its own movement after you've canceled yourself and you're just an observer. And you might think, yeah, but I'm an observer, I'm actually there. But the point for Hegel is that everything is actually always present, but it's in different forms of explicit and implicit. So when you cancel something, it's still kind of there in a way, but it's not appearing to you. It's not actual. It could be just possible. So he's just saying that this is so fundamentally deep. It's so much more fundamental than when Descartes was that it's hard for us to imagine it. But he's saying it's still coherent. It still has this kind of system in itself that leads us to pure being just by thinking it. Just by trying to follow the movements, we grasp that deeper logic. If you try and do something even less than that, it's just sheer incoherence. Like you can't make any sense of anything. You can't say anything about it. And that's kind of what the Tao is, right? But the Tao is still an affirmative thing that you can't maybe name the whole thing, but it's still there. It's still ising itself. And that's what pure being is. You can't say anything about it because we canceled everything. There's nothing even to compare it to. This paragraph is where I started developing this idea of how Hegel really begins the beginning. And is, I think for 200 years, I don't think anybody's really caught this in the way that Hegel means. So I hope this is really helpful to any Hegel graduate students, but even for people who really want the truth and have been looking at Taoism or these paradoxical beginnings, this is how Hegel's putting that paradoxical beginning of beginning eternity or beginning, something that might always have already been. This is how he's showing us to begin it. And it's a little bit of a trick of pure thought, but it makes sense. And you can try and think of something different. So I don't like that. Well, anything else is less satisfactory. And I think it's pretty clever. And it's what Descartes couldn't grasp. So that's the exact quote where I think Hegel deals with the skeptic pretty wisely. And another critique is that this is so crazy, this kind of supersensuous world. We don't know if that's really there or not. Is it really objective? Well, this is kind of where I get the quote for this quote. Well, this is the paragraph where I get this quote from the book, The Science of Logic itself. And he says, in book 1 of the objective logic, abstract being was exhibited as passing over into determinate being, but equally as withdrawing into essence. In book 2, essence reveals itself as determining itself into ground, thereby entering into existence and realizing itself as substance, but again, withdrawing into the notion. Of the notion, now, we have shown to begin with that it determines itself into objectivity. Those 3 sentences don't seem to make any sense. But to put this into context, he's really, if you don't understand how these pure thoughts are growing into themselves, he's talking in that living manner of the categories. And we don't think of our thoughts in an order, right? We're like Karl Popper, it's our subjectivity and it just matches with external objects. But Hegel's saying, no, we have the schema in our mind, and that is what we're projecting on the world, and the world is projecting into us. It's a dialectic of a back and forth, which is why Hegel uses a correspondence and a coherence model. But here's what this means when you're looking at it once you have absorbed the logic. And it starts to be coherent for you as a scientific system that can be checked and falsified. So in the first sentence, he says abstract being. Well, abstract being is just a fancy word for pure being. So when you grasp how to define these words, what their fundamental attributes are, you can recognize the universal categories in all these different expressions. So abstract being is just Hegel saying we're starting at the very beginning of a system. And then he says, abstract being was exhibited as passing over into determinate being. Okay, passing over, and here's determinate being. It's just a couple of categories away. He's skipping these categories, pure nothing and pure becoming. But they're all logically connected. They're all growing into each other in his work, which you can read yourself. But now he's jumping for this category. He's saying, okay, it's evolving into this version. And then the next thing he says is, but equally as withdrawing into essence. So what that means is, as it's moving forward, as it's moving down this way, it's actually also moving into the future categories. It's turning into them. It's like withdrawing into them. And so where's the category of essence? Well, Hegel's skipping all this development from determinate being, skip, 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 skip. And he's going all the way down and saying all this stuff happens, and then there's essence. So that sentence covered all this ground right here, withdrawing into essence. But you can see he's just going linearly. He's showing the living growth of these categories. Then if you read the next sentence, he says, in book 2, which is where essence begins, essence reveals itself as determining itself into ground. And ground is in the first moment, the first development of essence. Ground is the end of the first moment, which is where book 2 is talking about this revealing. And then it says this ground thereby enters into existence and is realizing itself in substance. Okay, well, it's still just continuing. So ground turns itself into appearance, and then here's the existence category entering into existence. And then here's substance down here, realize itself as substance. Oh, okay, and then it turns itself into the notion. And then the notion, he says at the end, objectivity. Why is he talking about objectivity? Because the notion develops itself into its own object. And this is where the objectivity kind of develops formally for the first time. So this is just Hegel in 3 sentences covering hundreds and hundreds of pages of pure thought developing itself in the universal logic. So I'm trying to show you that even though these paragraphs look incomprehensible as meaningless verbiage, when you understand the order, the right order makes all the difference. That's the thing Hegel did when he put all these philosophers together and identified the universals as our thought categories. And so the whole thing, everything he writes is kind of like this. But if you don't have the order, it's all going to seem like meaningless verbiage. So I hope this cheat sheet helps you to start grasping what these paragraphs are talking about, because he is saying something more profound than Descartes. It is absolutely incredible. And it is a more fundamental beginning where the truth of the thoughts have less assumptions to them, so they cohere better. They actually do seem to explain more, and we're able to think with a freer mind through these fixities and assumptions and immediacies that really should be moments that are mediated. We're just not reasonable enough to treat them that way. So we're stuck in them. So this objectivity of the logic, this stuff here in the comment I just showed you, that's happening in the supersensuous world. That's the pure categories thinking themselves. You've already canceled yourself. All this stuff is just happening with pure thought thinking itself. And you're just there implicitly watching in your own mind something that has always happened. You're like a window into that world, watching it. So he says, am I making this up though? Most people would be asking. Well, of the notion now, he says, we have shown to begin with that it determines itself into objectivity. That means that the categories are themselves doing this movement. He's also saying the notion of God to his existence. So this movement, so he says, it is self-evident that this latter transition is identical in character with what formerly appeared in metaphysics as the interference from the notion, namely, or from the inference from the notion, namely the notion of God to his existence, or as the so-called ontological proof of the existence of God. So he's saying that, wow, something is self-evident, which we thought was bad, because self-evidence means it's not proved. But he's saying that everything he's done is proved up to this point. He's just saying when we compare it, what he has done, what the people in the world have done less philosophically, they do correlate to each other. So he's saying that just by watching them both, you can see the characters are kind of aligning. That what he's doing in this final movement here, where the notion is turning into its own object, this is what Anselm and these other philosophers are trying to prove or trying to reproduce in the sensuous world. They didn't know about the supersensuous necessarily. They just left it as the indeterminate heaven, God, beyond type of thing. But really, they were just doing these pure thought categories, where the notion, which is supposed to be imaginary, it's just a concept in our imagination, turns itself into its own object. But object is kind of like the notion external to itself. So the object is outside the completed notion. The syllogism is the notion that develops itself, and then once it's completed, it turns into its object. And so you kind of have like a subject and an object, but the object is the syllogism. So it kind of has an existence. It kind of comes into the notion develops itself into an actual object, which is like solid, has its own being. It determines itself. And the ontological proof was to say, well, there's something so great, so amazing, that if there was something that was the best thing in the world, then the only thing better than thinking about the best thing in the world is to actually have it in the real world with real being, for it to actually exist. If you thought, oh, this popsicle, you're imagining it as the notion, like it's a concept in your head. Oh, you're imagining this amazing popsicle. It's so amazing. You know, the only thing better than thinking that is to actually have that popsicle in the real world with a being of its own, and you can enjoy it. He's saying God is kind of like that. That was Anselm's argument, that if God is the best thing in the world and there's nothing better than it, then that means it has to exist. It has to be an object in the world, because that's the only thing that is the best thing in the world. That's better than just the notion of the best thing in the world. But all that's happening is that the notion, these are the logical categories turning into each other. So this is God's mind thinking itself, or the atheist God thinking itself purely logically, the absolute atheism, right? And this is how we're supposed to show it scientifically with the universal categories. So this really is happening in the objective world. This is God becoming its own notion, its own concept to itself, thinking itself, and then turning it into its own object. God is turning itself into its own object through its own thinking in the supersensuous realm without us there. It's always eternal. It's happening, but it has always already happened. That's the sort of paradox of a timeless, spaceless realm that's always complete and perfect in itself. It's kind of like Plato's realm forms perfected, but it has this kind of cognition to it, this kind of subjectivity to it, that when it completes itself, it is perfect in itself, and then its object as real existence outside of its perfection becomes nature as the first moment of true rationality. And that's where we start coming in as free will, which religion and Christianity says, well, that's God's greatest gift to you, is to give you free will. But logically, it's yes, the Platonic realm, but it's not an impersonal realm. It is this kind of cognition that's building itself and becoming more and more concrete. That's why Plato is right. That's why the Christians are right. That's why the monotheists are right. That's why the polytheists are right. It's all just the science of logic looked at in its moments. And what we're doing here is we're starting to learn how to read Hegel in his true concreteness. And the only way to get past Descartes and these amazing thinkers is to really grasp that realm concretely, clearly. Because if you don't, you're going to end up making the same sensuous mistakes they did. You'll be trapped in the sensuous realm, and you can't break out of the matrix. We're trying to get to the world of pure thought, of pure truth. Learn the rules behind the code. This is how Hegel did it. That's why this objective moment is clear, or else you will think that you are in it. You will get your mixed up thoughts going back and forth. Your mind does happen, but it doesn't happen in this world purely. You're just a window watching this world, a world that has always been complete. You are returning to that world every time you learn something logically. You are kind of learning that world and rebuilding in your own mind, but it's always in you. The idea and the notion is always complete. It's always in you. The only thing that's changing is the cunning of reason, like we talked about in the previous sessions of spirit. It's just realization is the only thing that's changing. Making what is implicit, explicit, realizing it in a higher idea for yourself. So this is the paragraph where I started realizing Hegel was saying that this was an objective world, and it is a metaphysical world, and it's thinking itself. There is no I think therefore am. It's just thinking therefore is, that turns itself into an I, the notion, that turns itself into an object, its own existence, and then turns itself into an idea, which is completed existence of the notion of itself, and then that turns itself into nature as the opposite of that perfect reason. It's a freedom. Descartes, Hegel's kind of berating Descartes some more. He's saying Descartes' sublimest thought that God is that whose notion includes within itself its being, after being degraded into the defective form of the syllogism, that is, into the form of the said proof, finally succumbed to the critique of reason, and to the thought of that existence cannot be extracted from the notion. So this is more for the graduate students in philosophy who know about Kant. So the critique of reason is really Kant's critique of pure reason, where he was saying that this realm of objective pure thought is all imaginary. It's a thing in itself that we can never, it's not really imaginary. It's just a thing, it's a noumenon. that we can never know. Our subjective categories are always mixed up, and we can't know the thing in itself. And of course, Hegel's saying, yes, we can. The thoughts that we are thinking in our heads are in the actual world. We're just reuniting with it from this external object. We just have to realize that and recognize it for ourselves. And because Descartes put this ontological proof, so he's saying the notion, it has the being within it, that's just saying the object, like it's like when you're imagining the popsicle and then there's the real popsicle. Well, God, the awesome idea of God, and then the awesome God is actually existing. The being is in the notion. It's like it contains itself. That's the highest good. And he's saying because Descartes put this in a defective form of the syllogism, the formal syllogism, it's not the living syllogism. It has these presuppositions and this dead nature to it, where it made it easy to attack. And that's exactly what Kant did. He found those kind of contradictions or that incompleteness and undermined the proof. And so the objectivity didn't remain. And that's why Kant looked successful when he tried to create this tectonic shift in, in philosophy, where all of our categories and all this God stuff was really just our minds, and we have to purify our minds kind of thing, even though Kant was a theist. That's why we sort of lost this objectivity of pure thought. And we couldn't separate ourselves from sensuousness. So this is what he's saying in this paragraph. He's trying to get us to understand this objective world of supersensuousness is beyond our sensuousness, the realm of nature, and our subjective thinking, even though our subjective thinking is a fractal repeat of it. That's what makes it confusing. That's why the two worlds conflate, because we're pure thought and that's pure thought. But we're at a different realization of it, but our realization affects how we see it. So you have to be really clear, and Hegel luckily was clearer than most people and grasped it. So to go on, I hope that makes some sense. These paragraphs are notoriously impossible to interpret, and I think this is the first time in history somebody's going through it with this kind of clarity, thanks to Hegel being honest about it, and me being able to read him that way after 3,000 hours. I think this could really help people start moving philosophy towards its real position. So there's another quote here where I say, in volume 1, where being has vanished in its immediate opposite. So volume 1 is the objective logic, where we do the absolute negation, we get pure being, and it turns into pure nothing. This is where he's picking up here in this quote. And becoming has shown itself as the truth of both, right? So we have pure being, pure nothing, and then pure becoming. So this is the first three universals of the science of logic. Once the true beginning is established with not I think therefore I am, but thinking therefore is. Attention was drawn to the confusion that arises when, in the case of a particular determinate being, what is fixed on is not the being of that determinate being, but its determinate content. Then, comparing this determinate content, for example, $100, with another determinate content, for example, with the context of my perception or the state of my finances, it is found that it makes a difference whether the former content is added to the latter or not. And it is imagined that what has been discussed is the difference between being and not being, or even the difference between being and the notion. So this is just Hegel picking apart how Kant picked apart Descartes' sort of syllogism or the ontological proof by saying that these two things, the notion and existence, they're not pure thought. They're not sharing some kind of being. He's really trying to approximate being and non-being. So he's used an sensuous example to show that the mistake of Kant was that he was focusing on the sensuousness in his example, and the sensuousness doesn't apply to these pure thought categories of the real ontological proof of God, which is in Hegel's supersensuous realm, where I listed all those categories, the notion and the object, which is what this ontological proof is trying to show happens, that the being or the object is in the notion of it, or that the notion develops into its own object. They're necessarily linked and they both happen. This is not happening in the sensuous world. So when Kant is trying to attack it, he's not attacking on its own ground in its own pure philosophical form. He's using sensuous figures like he's mixing those two worlds, the pure world of the categories of the notion and then the actual sensuous world of the wallet and the money. And you say, yeah, it doesn't work that way in the sensuous world. You have to grab the objectivity of this world to really see how the notion and the object aren't a notion of something sensuous. It is not the object of something sensuous. These are pure categories moving in themselves objectively. So this is why the thought of God, that God's own thought of itself, or the absolute's own thought of itself atheistically, logically turns into its own object through the syllogism, the proper living syllogism. And this is the right way to cause the notion to turn into its own object, which is what Anselm and Descartes were trying to show, right? That notion is ultimate goodness. Hegel calls it blessedness, this thinking in contradictions that reintegrates into itself immediately, self-sublates, and then it turns into the completed form of itself, a developed blessedness, you could say, as the syllogism, the universal form of reason, that collapses as its own object. So now it actually exists as an existing syllogism immediately. So it's like the notion developed itself into an object that's completed, it's completed development. So you take all that notion in its immediacy, it exists now as complete. That's the real ontological proof. And it's happening not with 100 sovereigns or anything like that. That's why Hegel's saying, no, this is a completely different object than that. It's the objects of pure thought. It's the pure thought categories, the universals themselves. That's where the proof works. But what Kant did, because they couldn't break free of sensuousness, they were conflating the two, and then it doesn't apply. And I think that's pretty brilliant of Hegel. That's the super coherence in the supersensuous realm. But you have to know the logic. You have to be able to do that syllogism in a scientific way, in that highly coherent way, in order to get that scientific feeling of consistency, which we associate with truth, at least scientific truth. So there's a beautiful blend of what atheists want and what theists want at the exact same time. And it overcomes, it's what Descartes and all these guys were trying to do, but Hegel does it in its truth, in a clear way, which I think is brilliant. So do we have the real ontological proof now? Yeah. Yeah, we do. I think this is a lot clearer, a lot better. But of course, you can say, well, this doesn't, you have to grasp the logic in the order, and then you have to compare it to the current abstract way of doing science, and that's how you get the coherence, is the way you can say whether the universality makes more sense or not. So that's the trick here. That's why the universality is the hard thing to teach, that Descartes couldn't get to. Nobody could get to it except for Hegel. There were a couple of mystics in the past, like Meister Eckhart and all these types of guys, that got closer, but they never had a chance to do it. They were forced into religion or religious consciousness that was automatically sensuous. So when they tried to communicate the pure thoughts, they were forced to use church dogma, which stopped them. So they could have purified the church into the supersensuous message, but they weren't allowed, or they were killed. And even Hegel was being cautious at this time. So this is why Hegel's talking about the ontological proof. Further in the same volume, part 2, or page 112, we elucidated a determination that occurs in the ontological proof, that of a sum total of realities, but the essential subject matter of the proof, the connection of the notion and determinate being, is the concern of our consideration of the notion just concluded, and the entire course through which the notion determines itself is objectivity. Right? He's just explaining that motion in terms of pure thought. Determinate beings a way earlier category, but they're kind of fractal, they're repeating in a fractal way. So in a way where if you treat pure being like you have pure being, pure nothing, and pure becoming, that's kind of the first syllogism. Well, the same thing is happening with the notion. If you treat the notion as the first being, then you have the judgment as like a nothing, a process moment, and then the syllogism as the completed triad. And then the determination after that is the object, right? But in terms of pure being, pure nothing, pure becoming, the determination after that is determinate being. So you're seeing a parallelism happening here. That's why I think he's saying that the object is like the determinate being of starting the order. From that point, something like that is going on, this kind of fractal repeating. So this is why the language is hard to understand if you don't read the science of logic, if you don't grasp the order of those categories. The only reason why I'm able to make sense of this now, 3,000 hours, is because the order and the way they're moving into each other with the syllogism, that's what makes it possible to get out of ordinary thinking and grasp the livingness of those words. Otherwise, they stay in this confusing mess where you think you know what the words mean, but they're not in that order that Hegel puts them, right? 99.9% of us on Earth do not have our categories ordered in a logic like that. And I think he's right. I think we should do that. And that would make our life and our species and our thinking and our relationships so much more stable and beautiful and reasonable and moments of something divine, or at least something friendlier. I hope I did a good job explaining this paragraph. I could try and do more, but I think we get the point that this is really objective. That's the point here. When he's talking about realities, every moment, every second moment is like the moment of reality that's happening over. So every stage has a moment of reality that's kind of completing itself in the process. And when it kind of completes itself and the universals on this side are seen on this side, that's the moment where realization is complete. And then you get the sublation into a new higher universal. When it's process moment, the negative moment is completed, the realization is complete, and it kind of idealizes itself in sublation. So he's saying that, yes, technically it's true that God is the sum total of all realities, but it has to be in this logical order where they're nesting in each other, higher realities. It's not just this, it's just take them all together and don't define them. It's like the reality of all realities. So you're just making an empty claim. You know it's all the realities, but you're not showing what the realities are in a determinate way. And Hegel's saying in his version of the proof, yes, he is determining it, and you can think it for yourself. The first reality is kind of happening between pure being and pure nothing. And then when it completes it, when it realizes that it's immediately vanishing and there's two things there, it starts turning to pure becoming. And when that completes its realization, it's two moments of becoming in opposite orientations. And that's when you get to the next higher level, where reality starts on the next level, a higher determinate form. Determinate being turns into quality, and then it has this moment of realization into reality and negation in general. And then that turns into the something. And then that has its something other. That's another reality. So every form has its own reality. And that's why the divine idea is all of them. It's the reality of all those realities. I hope that makes sense. The logic in the order of it is pretty much everything, but you have to grasp it purely. Okay. And you have to grasp the absolute negation, and you have to grasp the subjectivity of it. To make my point more clear, so you still might be like, this still sounds like a bunch of hooey. I think cogito ergo sum is really what's happening here. Mark's not interpreting this pure being as like being somebody else is thinking it. But here's Hegel saying clearly in the science logic, no, we are absolutely not starting with any egos at all. If anything, you're just a window implicitly watching. They're saying this is something that's not an ego in itself in the beginning. There's no self here. So he's saying, but we cannot leave entirely unmentioned an original beginning of philosophy which has recently become famous, the beginning with the cogito, the beginning with the ego. And this is not just Descartes, it's Fichte, and like they're all trying to figure out how to start the beginning. So here, not even Fichte's version is, he's not going to get away with it with Hegel. It's the same problem as Descartes, except a little bit more in terms of pure thought, I guess, a little bit more developed, but it's the same logic. So he says, it came partly from the reflection that from the first truth, the entire sequel must be derived, and partly from the requirement that the first truth must be something with which we are acquainted, and still more, something of which we are immediately certain. So that's that moment that's that third principle of Descartes that we read earlier, that you're just immediately aware of sense certainty and all this kind of stuff. And you don't have to prove it. It's just self-evident. So this is kind of where the ego, he's just repeating it now. And he's saying, this beginning is, in general, not a contingent idea which can be differently constituted in different subjects. For the ego, this immediate consciousness of self at first appears to be itself both an immediacy and also something much more familiar to us than any other idea. Anything else known belongs to the ego, it is true, but it is still a content distinguished from it and therefore contingent. The ego, on the contrary, is the simple certainty of its own self. So you can try and start with this, but Hegel's saying, but the ego as such is at the same time also concrete. And what do we know about concrete? This is a really nebulous word in Hegel, but we're trying to get people to have like a PhD in Hegel and really understand the logic of these words. Concrete just means the opposite of abstract, holding two things separate and unconnected. Concrete means one thing that's holding its moments, its parts, in a necessary order, where they're moving together. They belong together. Belonging is important. When you sublate something, as we talked about earlier, it means you're taking things in a necessary right order where they belong together ideally. They're moments in this one whole. So you're saying the ego is like this. It's like this thinking, like this engine that's thinking. It's concrete, where its thoughts belong to it. When you have a thought, it's your thought automatically. It belongs to you. So the ego is actually the notion sublating itself over and over and over again. You are the notion, the supersensuous, objective, really cool thing. You are a repeating of it in sensuous form. That's why you have pure thought in yourself. That's why you think you're a pure I. But he's saying the problem is that when you have something concrete, it has moments in it. So then you got to ask the question, where did the moments come from? You have to justify where they came from. So it's no longer that nice immediacy where you thought you could just take this awareness of yourself as the beginning of knowledge, pure knowing, but you can't. He's saying the ego is actually not only just concrete, it's the most concrete thing of all. So down here, I'm just repeating him saying, yep, you can't start with the ego because it's not really immediate. It's concrete, and when you understand what concrete means, it can't be this sort of pure knowing. Saying that act, strictly speaking, would be nothing else but the elevation to the standpoint of pure knowing, where the distinction of subject and object has vanished. But as thus immediately demanded, this elevation is a subjective postulate. To prove itself a genuine demand, the progression of the concrete ego from the immediate consciousness to pure knowing must have been indicated and exhibited through the necessity of the ego itself. So you have to prove it through the ego. You can't bring anything from outside. But he's saying you can't do this. Without this objective movement, pure knowing, even in the shape of intellectual intuition, appears as an arbitrary standpoint, or even as one of the empirical states of consciousness with respect to which everything turns on whether or not it is found or can be produced in each and every individual. So intellectual intuition was like, you just understand. It's that sense certainty thing that Descartes was talking about earlier. So long story short, they're trying to get at this pure knowing. And he says, instead, such a beginning brings with it the disadvantage of the illusion that whereas the thing under discussion is supposed to be something familiar, i.e. the ego of empirical self-consciousness, it is in fact something far removed from it. When pure knowing is characterized as ego, it acts as a perpetual reminder of the subjective ego, whose limitations should be forgotten, and it fosters the idea that the propositions and relations resulting from the further development of the ego are present and can already be found in the ordinary consciousness. That just means it's loaded with assumptions, right? That's not justified. For in fact, it is this of which they are asserted. This confusion, far from clarifying the problem of the beginning, only adds to the difficulties involved and tends completely to mislead among the uninitiated and has given rise to the crudest misunderstandings. So yeah, he's just saying what we normally take as consciousness cannot be the true beginning. The ego can't be taken as the beginning because it's doing too much. So where did all that stuff come from that justifies this pure knowing? It comes from way earlier in the objective logic thinking itself. It does eventually give rise to you, but there's a lot that has happened before you even come along to experience immediacy for yourself. That's where he's really making it clear that Descartes, Fichte, you can't start with these things. You have to start with the objective true beginning where you're not there. Nobody's there. Not even its own ego. Pure thought doesn't even have its own ego yet. It's just thinking, therefore is. It's just this continuation of the resolve to know the truth. And you're like, where did the resolve come from then? Well, you cancel that. You're just getting back in touch with this world that always thought itself. It's your window into a paradox, basically. A koan put in scientific form. So getting towards the end here, this concept of pure knowing is coming up. We're not just talking about pure being. Now Hegel's mentioning pure knowing. So we're trying to find out what can we build pure thought on. Well, thinking and being are in a dialectic. And that's kind of what one of the principles above was talking about with Descartes, is that being in existence, being in thinking, God and being, immediate knowing, all these things are in a way approximating that being is thinking, thinking is being. They're turning into each other. They're actually the same thing, but also distinct. So in the beginning, when you start with pure being, you're also just doing that negation, right? Oh, that negation is just going over. The method is just negation, 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 negation. That's it. Everything is just negation. That's the method in the beginning because you're not assuming anything. You're just continuing the canceling thing. And the canceling thing turns into this determining process that eventually turns into the syllogism that you can look back on and say, oh, it was all a syllogism. But while you're doing it, while pure thought is doing this itself, it doesn't even know it's the syllogism. It's just doing its own being perfectly by following the dialectic. It doesn't really know it's following the dialectic. It knows it implicitly because it's always eternally complete. But it's not doing this explicitly. It's just carrying itself out immediately. So that's why its being is its thinking. It's happening at the same time. So there's this big argument in philosophy between one dialectic that has two opposites on it. Being, epistemology and ontology are treated as two opposites. Ontology is about what really exists, what has real being, and then epistemology is what can we know? What's real knowledge? What is truthful knowledge about what maybe exists? But as much as these look like opposites, Hegel starts them both at the same time. They have to basically because we're not assuming anything, right? We're not assuming anything that keeps them apart. So that's what speculative philosophy is. We're seeing things happening at the same time, but in the right order, which is logic. And not just our subjective logic, not Kantian logic, not subjective idealism, absolute idealism, where realism, all those moments of reason in the ontological proof are all in their dialectical order, scientific order, thinking themselves purely. So that first thought, pure being, we got to it from pure thinking, right? Pure thinking is the absolute negation of everything, the absolute thought that cancels itself into sheer immediate indeterminacy. But when that negates itself, when it tries to know itself, when it is just itself, it doesn't have to do anything, it's just itself, it kind of it mimics thinking, it negates itself automatically. And that back and forth, Hegel calls like an empty intuiting. But in the first chapter of the Science of Logic, where he's saying that this is an empty intuiting, and like literally the first, when the science really begins, he says this is like an empty intuiting, but intuiting doesn't really exist there because intuition is a self thing. It's what a self does, right? We have intuition in the sensuous world, but he's saying that there is no mind down there with pure being. It's just negation comes through as there's nothing it's negating into. It's just the movement of nothingness again through a indeterminacy, and you get like another indeterminacy that you try and grasp onto, but it has to have like this affirmative to go back to, and you end up with this back and forth. And this empty intuiting is not a psychological intuiting. There's no psychology here. It's just pure thought doing its thing dialectically. I hope that makes a little bit of sense, but this is what pure knowing is. It is ontology. Pure being is the ontology part. It's a being. It's actually there. It's like the real first pure being. It's not in your head. That thing exists somewhere in the eternal realm of spaceless timelessness. And it's also the first thing that it knows of itself in this immediate knowledge. That's why it's kind of like intuition. It doesn't have any external reflection. You are kind of watching it as an implicit external reflection, but you shouldn't be adding anything to it or else you're tainted. You're supposed to be watching it do its own thing. But it is simultaneously being and thinking at the same time. It's epistemological and ontological in every movement. And that's why it others itself later on to have the irrational world, nature, as a separation that it can return and reflect back on itself so it has real knowledge of how perfect it is. And that's what absolute spirit is. That's what you become as a genuine philosopher. I hope that kind of completes the loop. But all these other philosophers were trying to approximate this pure knowing, but they couldn't really grasp what was the pure being and pure knowing. Descartes had those principles above to try and grasp this, but now we have the clarity thanks to Hegel to really put these things in order and grasp them in a deeper logic, a deeper sense of coherence. It just makes a lot more sense what people were trying to do, whether you are theist or atheist. Both of them are getting what they want from this discussion, but they're also both having to give up the unessentials of their positions. But if they focus on the ideal, they'll see their moment, and it's very beautiful. So in these final paragraphs, This is the feeling you should be getting when you're doing speculative philosophy. True, genuine philosophy feels like this coherence is building. Even though it looks contradictory, it makes sense that that first moment is epistemological and ontological. Because in order to know anything, you have to have an affirmative that starts to become determinate. And that's what's happening. The first one's a distinction, a determination that's no determination, because it's the same thing moving in between itself in two different kind of forms. That's not a complete form yet. So you kind of have knowledge about it. But if it was just pure canceling, then there's nothing to know. So that first thought is where something stables. It's not even stable. It's just there's something ising there that you can try and maybe get to know, even though you're not really trying to know. It's just now doing its own thing immediately. It's following its own destiny, you could say. So that's kind of where this profound interpretation of Hegel's, it looks contradictory, but it's making some sense, right? Because if there's nothing there to know, you can't know it. So that's why it's happening simultaneously. There's not two distinct things happening, because then you have to justify where the separation comes from. It's just happening immediately because it's pure thought. So let's finish off here. He says, further, as regards the subjective determinateness of the ego in general, it is true that pure knowing frees the ego from the restricted meaning imposed on it by the insuperable opposition of its object. But for this reason, it would be superfluous at least to retain the subjective attitude and the determination of pure knowing as ego. So when you try and have knowledge, you have to have an object that's separate to know something. Otherwise, it's meshed up in you and there's no determination between you and an object, right? So he says you can try and get rid of that opposition and you end up in this subjectivity, but you can't say anything about it. And he's saying this kind of pure knowing, this kind of fake freeing of the ego doesn't define ego. Hegel does eventually sublate the object with the subject, subjectivity with all of objectivity, to arrive at the very end with absolute spirit. You do carry that out, but it's once all the determinations are known and that subject, that ego is determined. You're not just saying ego and then hoping everything works out and then get rid of the object and say, now we just have ego there. Well, what's the ego? Now it's really indeterminate. Now it's just superfluous. You can't say anything about it. At least the object could have said something about it. But yes, Hegel's not doing this. This is not the correct way of doing pure knowing. So it's another tricky way to try and get people to think you can start with the ego without doing the science of logic, without knowing the right order. He's saying you can't do that. This determination, however, not only introduces the disturbing ambiguity mentioned, but closely examined, it also remains a subjective ego. The actual development of the science, which starts from the ego, shows that in the development, the object has and retains the perennial character of an other for the ego, and that the ego, which formed the starting point, is therefore still entangled in the world of appearance, and is not the pure knowing, which has in truth overcome the opposition of consciousness. So here's him finally saying that not only is this ego concrete and has a bunch of determinations in it, but most people treat it with this object that is sensuous, and that it keeps them trapped not even in the pure ego, which is the notion in the objective world. They're still over here in the sensuous world thinking about it. And so they never get out of the appearance, to get to the pure thoughts. And as we talked about in Buddhism, the appearances are always in flux, and you can't really grasp the universals and put them in their order in that plant-like living way that Hegel does. To get out of that confusion, that conflating, that kind of subjective ego that Descartes was trapped into. Okay. We return to objectivity, the importance of that logic. Now we're going to return to the final statement that this is where Hegel himself says, this is where real philosophy begins. It's not me making it up. I think this is the true interpretation of Hegel, as incredible as it sounds. It's epistemological, it's ontological, it's empirical, it's also a priori. It's all of them. He's doing all those moments that most people in history either interpret Hegel in one box or the other. I'm trying to give you a sense, even if this doesn't make sense, that there's a way to think about Hegel where he's doing all of those things that separate people in philosophy currently, because nobody's doing the whole system, the whole circle. They have little pockets, little pigeonholes, and then they try and fit Hegel in there because he's doing them all. So you can read whatever you want to him, but you're chopping him up and not letting the true abundance come out where everybody's idealized. Those who want to see him as an epistemologist, they're idealized. They are a moment, a critical, necessary moment. Those who want to see it as ontology, like Heidegger, that is all just being, well, they're right too. The science of logic is the general being turning into all its other beings, including Dasein. People who want to see it as theist, they can get that too. There's the absolute concrete. The people who are atheists and they don't want it to be some God beyond that they have to submit to and not know in themselves, no, they get that too. They're determining this. They're spirit. They're the Ubermensch. The people who want to see it as a priori, pure reason, they get what they want. That this world is objective. The people who want to see it as a posteriori and sensuous and empirical and nature, and they get that as well. And the correspondence model of truth. So you get all these moments happening, and this is a pretty dense section that if you don't get beyond these abstract understandings and start sublating them, you can't get past Descartes. So that's how we're doing it, is that you have to understand the contradictions like Hegel does in that right order. And that's why I showed it to you before and why I'm taking some time to go through every word, because it's really hard to understand why the heck Hegel's talking about Descartes in the beginning of the science of logic, or Descartes or Kant or Jacobi. He's criticizing them all, but also praising them in the beginning. So he's doing that back and forth. So I hope to have done something that nobody has done in 200 years. And it might not make sense, but if you keep listening to this, it really cuts down the thousands of hours it took me to get here. And at a minimum, it should start giving people confidence that this is where the new research in philosophy should be, is understanding the tremendous insight of what Hegel has done, and that we can create a peaceful revolution based on this, because as he says here in the final paragraph, consequently, whatever is intended to be expressed or implied beyond being in the richer forms of representing the absolute or God, doing that both secularly and religiously, this is in the beginning only an empty word and only being. We're making that mistake of not determining it. It's far away. You can't know it for yourself. This is the type of beginning he just taught us not to do. This simple determination, which has no other meaning of any kind, this emptiness, is therefore simply as such the beginning of philosophy. So he's saying that he is repeating that moment, but he's doing it in the right context now, in its right position. Whereas everybody else was doing it in this abstract way, which you could never know it. He's saying that never knowing moment is the beginning, but he's positioned it in such a way through the absolute negation and this presupposition that is no presupposition. He gets beyond the cogito ergo sum, the ego itself. He's getting back to the objective world of pure thought and getting rid of all the confusion with nature and all this. I'm saying it's just dialectic now. It's speculative thought that's going to take that indeterminacy, that God that was beyond, and show that it determines itself for you as you're thinking it, along with it. You're not doing the thinking, you're just allowing it to happen through you. You're active in holding back all your stuff, but it's passive in that you're just absorbing what really has gone on for eternity in this supersensuous realm. And that indeterminacy becomes determinate in all these realities. That becomes wisdom. And that's why it's the beginning of philosophy, because all wisdom is based on that beginning of pure being. I hope that makes sense. That's why that was the limit of Descartes, and why he didn't achieve genuine philosophy, but started genuine abstract philosophy. And I hope that makes that clear and what the difference between the two is. Now that we've entered, welcome to the realm of genuine philosophy. Now that we've entered the realm officially, not just abstract philosophy, but genuine philosophy, we're breaking free of the matrix and entering the world of pure thought and seeing the code in our consciousness and in the world. This is the circle again that we saw at the beginning that didn't make a lot of sense. But if you listen to this conversation a few times and take Hegel seriously, there is a incredible clarity here where we've changed this circle of reason, and the positions are now in their right positions with their right labels. So the true beginning starts here with pure being. This is the science of logic. Instead of logic going the backwards way, in the other diagram it was going the wrong way. Now we're showing it going from one to the next in the right order. pure being or the science of logic, the supersensuous realm. All of this is the supersensuous realm, where this ontological proof that Hegel's talking about that he's doing is here before it even reaches nature. But then it sublates itself into nature, and then we get all space, time, and all the stuff that we're used to, plants, animals, all this stuff. And then we get spirit, the notion from this world, the supersensuous, coming into and realizing itself in the sensuous world as us, as human consciousness and reason for the first time, but in early form, like Neanderthals maybe. And I know that the religious don't think that there's evolution, but Hegel's saying that there's two things happening here, Darwinian and also this divine evolution. It's not just random. Reason is coming from this perfect logic. So even though it looks random, natural selection, that is how it's happening. That's how the idea is purifying itself. But it's not purifying just randomness. It's uncovering this kernel of what religion is calling divine. So you get the best of both worlds. The caprice of the world is moving through in its absolute freedom, and it can break free of this perfect knowledge, the divine idea. But the divine idea is still coming through and realizing itself at higher levels, at more and more explicit versions of the idea, higher realizations as the idea grasping itself, which is you as absolute spirit, the absolute Übermensch, the existentialist that achieves your mastery and destiny, self-determining it while discovering it. So you start here, and then you start to develop, and then you return back as the ground of your own logic. You start thinking the logic purely as a genuine philosopher. So this is the true beginning. This is where Hegel is. This is what Kant couldn't grasp. That's why you can run, but you can't hide. There's a little speculative pun there. It starts with pure being, right? Which is also pure knowing, ontological and epistemological at the same time. And it's mind-blowing. But then it puts into clarity where Descartes is. So Descartes, now we know, didn't start with this pure knowing, pure being. He started with the ego. But the ego only comes after the notion emerges in sensuous form. This is the empirical consciousness he was talking about before. But the first part is anthropology. The soul and all this stuff develops according to Hegel, the subconscious, basically in modern terms. And then this is the point of phenomenology. So this is where Descartes kind of comes in with sense certainty, where he negates all sense certainty. And he says that I am just the pure self thinking itself. And then he allows us to reanalyze all the sense data and the phenomenology and all this. And he continues to develop. But of course, only Hegel makes this last little connection with absolute spirit here, where spirit really develops itself in this final section and grasps the pure thoughts as pure thoughts in that logical order. So that's where we are as genuine philosophers. We're trying to do this last little step that's missing in society, because nobody understands sublation. Nobody understands how sublation is the living logic of the categories that we use every day. Nobody ever thinks to question it, right? Because nobody is really critical enough. Not even Descartes. So that's why people think, oh, Hegel's so positive. Hegel is more negative than most skeptics, including Descartes, but he's also more positive too. He does both of them because he's speculative. He's ontological, epistemological, theist, atheist. He's all of them, but you have to grasp the order. That's the thing I'm trying to show here that's really hard. I can't just say it in a pithy statement. It's the determining of it that has that resonancy, that coherence that you can think for yourself. So yeah, Descartes is here, but here's something else. Remember how we said that most people start reading Hegel at where he truly begins, which is his first masterwork, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And there's a lot of confusion about how to even start reading Hegel, never mind where Hegel said to where the real beginning is. Well, this is the mistake they're making. Here's his book here, The Phenomenology of Spirit. Phenomenology of Spirit starts at the same place Descartes does with Cogito Ergo Sum. So if Descartes was to write how Hegel wrote, his book would have looked like The Phenomenology of Spirit in a certain way, because they're both just starting with the ego. But in Hegel, he's coming from the point of view of the ego, so it's not knowing itself as ego, it's just doing the ego stuff. There's no self-reflection yet until self-consciousness and later stages as reason. But that's why they both kind of begin in this area. And of course, that's not the true beginning. This is just a primer, an introduction into what it looks like from what you're familiar with, right? You're familiar with space, time, perception, understanding, all this kind of stuff. The reason why Hegel starts there is because he knew you wouldn't understand the true beginning, because it's so abstract that nobody can imagine. They can't separate sensuousness or empirical consciousness from pure thought objectively, like we did in this talk. And it still might not be making sense to you, but you have to think it through for yourself, and eventually you will achieve it. And there's a profound clarity there that makes Descartes make sense, and Kant and everybody else, what they were really trying to do in the true system of philosophy. This is the true beginning of how to think clearly in a higher wisdom, where it's all connected together as moments in this circle of reason. I hope that makes sense. I hope some of us are feeling like this. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe you're just in pain, but it does get better. So once people start grasping this, it emboldens your spirit, because you can idealize anybody. So you won't negate people right away, which is what we're doing by default all over the world. You can love Kant, you can love Descartes, but you can also break out of the matrix, and you can see the limit of it. You can see the goodness in everybody, because if they're a philosophy, they have a moment, and people want to feel that. And when you point out their true limit in a way that they can recognize, they will self-transcend, they will self-sublate themselves. And that's the best way to learn. That's what Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, that's what they were doing with their students. That's the kind of learning that education should be fundamentally based on. And I hope I helped you see through these cryptic passages of Hegel just by the simple grasping of the order and the syllogism, but not the formal syllogism that's abstract like Descartes, but the actual living kind of syllogism that develops itself. So if you want to join on the peaceful revolution, and you can sense the coherence here. This doesn't exist in the world. We could have a society that feels like this, has this kind of coherence, that has this feeling of belonging that we all kind of want in a higher spirit. So we're going to create a peaceful revolution through coherence, just by teaching this and overcoming the abstractions that are making it hard to learn from ordinary pain of our society. But if you don't believe what's going on, or it's not coherent to you, feel free to negate. Negation is the first part of sublation. Go to Hegelians Who Want to Change the World Facebook group. If you want to take a crash course, you can take the wisdom quiz, and the wisdom quiz is just testing your one-sidedness. Are you just epistemological, or are you ontological? Are you just one or the other, or can you do both? Can you sublate them? But how would you sublate them determinately? You can say that you sublated them, but that's that empty thinking, right? That's not really saying anything. It's like, well, how do you do it? How do you determine it? That's the wisdom that we're trying to give with the ordering. There's also the synchronicity document of philosophies, where you can start applying this to entire philosophers, like we just did with Kant, with Descartes. Every philosopher has their own column where we're going to do that. And we're going to find the coherence between all of them. They're all just doing that same order in different fragmented orientations on that circle of reason, where philosophers didn't know they were on that circle. But we do now for the first time, and we can help clarify where their truth is and where their limit was, and put them as a necessary moment and make them beautiful. And we're studying and extract the principle of wisdom. Then you can use this with technologies in the world and make sure that wisdom is running the world's disruptive technologies. The most disruptive technology of all, which is going to be a disruption that is no disruption, speculatively speaking, is of course this technology of coherence, this God coherence, this absolute coherence, this absolute science, this absolute logic. Then you have, of course, this affecting our interpersonal relationships. The limit of your reason is the limit of your friendship. You can take Help Me Spread the Universal Survey of Wisdom to figure out where we need to start sublating practically. There's all the live streams on how to, well, I'm going to try and sublate people in these live streams, kind of like as a example of how to do this, practically speaking. Then this is going to lead to an ideal kind of state, a new world spirit that is not colonialism or any of these types of things, by grasping the universal form of reason, which is that syllogism in its living order, and then paying respect to everybody by going into their philosophies like we did with Descartes, and use their terminology, pure knowing, Cogito Ergo sum, all these types of things. You can go and do that with Christianity, Islam, any religion, even though it's not technically a philosophy, it still has sensuousness. If it has universals in it, you can find them. The logic is immanent. You can make art ideal, you can make religion ideal, you can make philosophies and philosophers like Descartes or Kant ideal. The Vedas, even ancient philosophies and religions, you can find the universals in all of them, even though it might not be explicit to them. That's your gift as a genuine philosopher in that high clarity of thinking. So tomorrow, we're going to talk about how, now that we're on the native soil of philosophy itself, this pure thought thinking itself, now that we're here and we've sublated religious consciousness and we're in a new abundant clarity that makes sense and preserves the concreteness of religion, and we're sublating the capitalism, socialism, communism divides, or the ontology, epistemology. We're sublating contradictions that have stood for thousands of years incredibly powerfully. They become fluid moments we can think through harmoniously. We can heal entire divides of philosophers and people all around the world. Billions of people are being separated by these intangible, pure thoughts, literal double binds that we can resolve. So now we're going to talk about how tomorrow we're going to steer this ship in a more practical way, and talk about what kind of leaders do we want and what kind of leaders are shaped by this kind of clarity and this kind of reason that transcends ordinary sensuous consciousness. How do you lead with pure thought once you're in the realm of philosophy? So please join me next time, and I hope you enjoyed. Keep sublating and stay free.